Oh,
Hi
it's very noisy.
everyone. It's recorded. Welcome to the Francis Fogel Story Strategist podcast. My name is Francis Fogel, and today my guest is Mr. Mark Dodds.
Hello.
Hello, Mark. Mark is a new friend of mine, and he is, as he describes it, the convener for the People's Pub Partnership, a pragmatic plan for creating a national social enterprise pubco for a grassroots people powered Green New Deal, which is full of really beautiful, ambitious, utopian words and phrases, which we're going to ask Mark to deconstruct shortly. Mark and I met on LinkedIn, which is where all the best relationships start, because I shared my thoughts on a sexy event that I went to at the Conduit, which I've described to Mark as a mixture between Soho House and the Marxist Party. And the event I went to was the rise of right-wing governments. And I wrote up the event, which was hosted by John Alexander, who we are both fans of, who wrote Citizens. And Mark saw my post and reshared it, which I was very honoured by. And so started
Thank
to
you.
look into Mark, noticed that he had a huge following. 4,739 people want to hear what Mark has to say about the independent pub industry in this country. And just before I invite Mark to explain why he's the expert, I should just say that when I fantasize about who I would most like to work with in my capacity as Francis Fogel story strategist, it's either farms with glamping sites and rewilding activities, yoga studios and other fun things like that, or it's amazing pubs in London and the southeast that are sitting on gold mines of heritage stories that are kind of slightly overwhelmed as to how best to use them. So Mark and I have already had quite a lot of banter, but he is now here on the podcast, and now I hand over to you, Mark, to tell us about your experience with pubs and why you're here.
Right, thanks, Francis. Very nice of you to invite me as well. And um, yeah, why am I here? Yeah, we did a little dry run on this, didn't we? And I ran off down a rabbit hole, saying my tale is my tale is a tale of woe. But I'll just leave that to one side for the moment. The reason I was interested in your post about the conduit meeting and the far right government thing is that these are issues that really concern me deeply, and I think I think basically everybody who's I think rational people are extremely concerned everywhere about what's happening politically. And the project I've been working on for a very long time now, this People's Pub Partnership, is a kind of recognition of that concern, and it's about giving people agency around their local pubs. And we're all affected by this apparently inexorable swing towards the right, as we are climate crisis and failing state and all kinds of other things. And my background, largely as an adult, was spent learning about the British pub sector by being a publican who signed a title lease on a pub in Camberwell in London in 1995 a pub called the Sun and Doves. And I knew from my previous background to that, I had a lot of catering experience, project management experience, and building experience because I'd been a landscaper for quite a while as well. That I could apply all of my skill set to this building and make it into a really good pub. I was very confident I could do that, and I was confident it would work because I'd lived in Southeast London for about 10 years and there were no decent pubs anywhere to go to. So although it was a big step in a sense into the unknown because I'd run small business in landscaping before, I'd never done anything like run and set up and found a whole thing like that, a bricks and mortar based thing. And so I was aware of a few gaps in my experience, like just a few gaps in my experience. anyway, along the way, so what I knew at that point in 1995 was there were no decent pubs southeast of the river, and I could if I could get this place, I could turn it into a fantastic pub. Um, and the rationale behind that was there was nowhere decent to go to. I surmised that I am not alone in thinking there should be a decent pub somewhere to go to in southeast London, and then I began to learn a whole lot of stuff about civil society from that point onwards. And anyway, the long and the short of that is I did get a lease on the pub. I did run it for 16 years. It opened in December 95. In May 96, it was nominated Time Out Bar of the Year. And it was a runner-up. And then in 1998, it was nominated Evening Standard Pub of the Year, and it was a runner-up in that as well. And at the time, it was a really big kind of, I don't know what you call it, some kind of social earthquake southeast of the river. And incidentally, at the same time, parallel, directly, immediately alongside me, there was a guy called Robert Harrison, who had a couple of business partners as well, who took on a pub at the other end of Cold Harbour Lane. I was in the Campbell end. I was at the Camberwell end. The Sun and Doves was took on another pub at the other end, which was called the Atlantic originally, I think, and turned it into the Dog Star. And we opened within a week of each other in December 1995, and they were the kind of rocking, busy, kind of frenetic, wild evening nightclub stroke pub DJ place. And down the other end, we were the kind of more serene, cradle to grave, family oriented, everybody interested, come along and enjoy yourselves, artists and whatever, everybody else come along. And we met each other in the Camberwell Magistrates Courts in getting our license transfers. And our eyes our eyes met across a busy room because it was full of Asian and African shopkeepers who were getting I presume their off licenses sorted out. And there was like literally dozens and dozens of people around, and we were the only guys who we were the only white guys there, and the whole thing was just surreal basically. And we both caught each other's eyes at the same time. It's like a weird love it's like a weird love affair starting, although we didn't see much of each other after that. But our lives then peeled off and did parallel experiences. I had a tied lease with my pub. My freeholder was, there's a whole lot of detail around this, but it was essentially turned into Scottish in Newcastle. I took on a lease with one entity, which was a landlord, and then it sold me and my pub to another entity, which was Scottish in Newcastle, Pub Enterprises. And Robert, the other end of Cold Harbour Lane, he ended up with Punch Taverns. And then our rent reviews were in sync with each other because they were 5-yearly rent reviews and so on and so forth. And we both learned about the calamities of being a tied tenant. And no matter how successful you are, the pubco, the entity that you pay your rent to, comes after you and tries to get all of your profit. And that sums up 16 years really. And whilst maintaining a pub for 16 years, which was constantly winning awards, very busy, on the outside, very successful, I managed to not be able to draw any income from the pub for the last 6 years of its existence because it was breaking even without me taking anything. And I had a private income from a flat above, which I rented out illegally, actually, because I was in breach of my lease, and if the freeholder had known that, they could have forfeited the lease, and so on and so forth. And I learned along the way an incredible depth of appreciation for pubs for their true value. And my pub transformed Southeast London basically. And Robert, and it was a romantic association in the sense in that we were on Cold Harbour Lane. It was called the Front Line, and it was all this violent stuff. And actually, our experiences rather varied from that kind of suggestion of this terribly rough place in Southeast London. And the Sun and Doves was among some of the poorest wards in Britain. Yet right alongside some some really basically very wealthy pockets as well, like I suppose lots of London is. And along the way, so when the pub first opened, so it's right. Okay, key thing to say is It was a rundown, rubbish pub that nobody went to. And I know this because I went there for a year with my girlfriend before I ended up getting a lease. And generally, there was no one else in the pub apart from us. And what got me interested in this pub was like, how come this place is on? How come it's open, basically? And we were going there on Friday nights in the winter. We're literally the only people in the pub, and it was sweltering hot. And I asked the people who were running the place. They said, "Oh, we're a holding management. We're holding management. We're waiting for them to sell the lease or sell the field or whatever." So I made inquiries, and I ended up taking on the pub, and then refurbishing it, and instantly making it a really busy pub. And this is not rocket science. It's if you know what you're doing professionally with in the hospitality business, and it may sound grandiose or arrogant or whatever, I don't know, but it's not. It's just very easy to make places that are very attractive to people because pubs particularly, because people are hyper-social creatures that want to go and enjoy themselves with each other, and they like meeting other people, and the pub is part of that. And the problem surrounding that statement in itself is pubs are very complicated places to get right if you don't know what you're doing. And this is where the kind of confusion about the pub in Britain comes from. We have a culture in Britain where the pub is part of our cultural DNA. It's been ubiquitous for centuries, and it's been under threat for 100 years. I think it was in 1912, Hilaire Belloc famously wrote his poem, which I now can't quote, but about beware losing your pubs, for you will have lost the last of England. And I get emotional just saying that, actually, just remembering that. And then 100 years later, it got to 2013, and I was thinking, well, this is really what's happening, because I understood that what is happening is most of the pubs in Britain are owned by private equity, property-owning companies who call themselves pubcos, who oblige the tenants, the thousands of tenants that they have, to sign a lease that has a side agreement, which is called a beer tie or a supply tie. And that agreement, it's a contract. It's an inalienable contract. That contract means you're then obliged as a tenant paying rent to this pub company to buy your goods from their wholesale price list, and they are in charge of the cost of the wholesale costs. Basically, they're in charge of your rent. And in theory, when you've got a business-to-business relationship like this between a tenant of a commercial property who is a business and a business owning the commercial property, in theory, there's a kind of parity of power when it comes to rent review and so on. But in practice, you've got a tenant who's one person on their own, or a couple on their own, or a very small company, and you've got a huge behemoth that owns 2,000, 3,000, whatever, thousands of pubs that have got retained legal departments that do this stuff all the time. And all the things which on paper in the lease look like benign, perfectly reasonable terms of how the rent negotiations should be conducted. When you get into the rent negotiations, you realize you haven't got a leg to stand on, basically, because they could just run rings around you with evidence that your rent is too low. And it's an arcane, completely opaque process as well, which is designed to make it very difficult for people to have rational rent reviews. So the tendency in Britain over the last, since 1995 is when I signed my lease. It was actually around about 1990, 1989, the beer orders came into effect, which broke up the monopoly of big brewers in Britain and threw thousands of pubs onto the market. Which all this stuff gets very messy, and it can go on for hours explaining how this all came about. But basically, the Thatcher government changed the pub sector radically by separating the interest of the majority of freehold pubs in Britain being owned by big brewers, and in order to break those various monopolies, they announced pretty much overnight that no brewer could own more than 2,000 pubs, which meant something like 14 of, I don't know how many, it was maybe as many as 20,000 pubs were kind of on the market looking for a home, and the home was private equity, and all these pubs had tenants in them. They were operating businesses. They had sitting tenants in them, and then pub companies, these tied pub companies I've just kind of touched on before, emerged from this which is basically accountants and being counters and suits who understand things like financialization and leveraging debt against property values and so on. And they were incentivized by banks like Nomura, commercial banks, the people doing this, setting up these entities to do the best they could, and you could get 10% of the profits is your bonus. So in one year, one of these chief executives of pubco made 10 million quid in his bonus out of transacting stuff around pubs. And then people like me, thousands of people like me, 35, 38,000 people like me, were running these businesses. Now, I got in after one of those businesses had failed, and it was in 1995. This is how the era of the pub company was kind of emerging from this era of the brewers, and completely unknown to anybody really. We did not know this in the country. We just saw our pubs not being very good. And this is around about the time of the gastropub revolution, which came about as a result of all of this freeing up of these pub freeholds. And the Eagle. Do you know the Eagle in Farringdon Road?
No,
It's
but I
very.
do know the Sun and Doves. I've never actually told you that when I
Oh,
was
right.
so I went to university in Birmingham with somebody who lived in Camberwell, and this was in 2000.
All
And I
right.
believe that I went to the Sun and Doves with
Yeah.
Amy.
Good. Well,
But it's funny
yeah.
because I don't think I shared that with you last time. And so when you talk about your pub, I
Yeah.
believe I remember exactly what you were saying. So I remember being in the room.
Good.
So I just wanted to say that. But no, I don't know the other pub that you just mentioned.
Um, no, it's okay. So the Eagle on Farringdon Road was I was 1995. They was I think 1993. I think it might have been 91. There were two guys that I knew from working in the West End in restaurants in the West End, and they took on. So it's near the Guardian, what was the Guardian headquarters on Farringdon Road, and it became an instant success. And they did an extraordinary fresh Portuguese menu from a kitchen on view behind the bar, and it's just a great no nonsense pub, and it is a brilliant iconographic 20th century pub. It's they reinvigorated the pub to be relevant to the 20th century, and then loads of people like them. I'm a bit like them. We worked in restaurants in the West End, came out and started doing the same, and taking on pubs and turning them into quite interesting places, really. And the Sun and Doves, I wanted it to be um, I wanted it to appeal to everybody for quite sensible reasons, because the more people you appeal to and you succeed in pleasing, the more people come to your pub, right? And it is called a public house. And I didn't have any romance about this. It was all about trying to make my pub as popular as possible. And as I said a little bit ago, I learned loads of stuff about why pubs are so valuable to us as a society, because people came into my pub that I'd invested all this time and energy and risk in, and said things like, "You really fucked up what was once a really good pub." and and I'd literally been going there for a year before, and no one was ever going in. And I was going, "Why? What do you mean? What do you mean?" And the odd people would say this kind of thing, and they tended to be, no, they didn't tend to be. They were men who are as old as I am now,
Mm.
who seemed to be living locally and a little bit lonely, and feeling that anything like what was a traditional boozer that was empty and not actually trading very well, anything different was some sort of defiling history or something like this. I don't know I don't really what was going on with it. But then other people would come in and say, absolutely love what you've done to the neighborhood. You've doubled the value of my house, and things like this. And
Can I ask you a
meanwhile,
question? Have you
yeah,
read
of
the book?
course.
Have you read the book Wilding by Isabella Tree?
No, I haven't. No.
She talks about the exact equivalent in the farming world,
All right.
where people of a certain generation who came to see what they were trying to do on Nep estate,
Oh yeah.
when they started to, as they called it, wild it in the end, not really
Yeah.
wild it. People who were so used to that kind of, what's the word? Like the undulating fields of the arable
Yeah.
English country
The
landscape
the
that
the,
had
the
been
English
over
rural idyll.
farmed. But it,
Yeah.
but it, and that's what people thought of as the rural idyll, when in fact
Yeah.
it wasn't at all. It was over engineered farmland.
Absolutely.
And she said in her book that there was actually a gentleman who was over that age, who said to his son, you don't know what you're talking about. Before they over farmed it, this place was full of butterflies, full of,
Really.
you know, these crazy things that people are now calling weeds,
Yeah, yeah,
and all
yeah,
these amazing animals. And it
yeah.
just reminds me of that. Yeah, it's that thing of people really don't like what they're not used to, and they
Absolutely.
imagine that they romanticize, you know, even if the thing
Yeah,
that they're romanticizing is awful, that's better
yeah.
to them than, you
No,
know,
it's true. I
what's
mean,
for the best.
we're interesting creatures really like this, and even yeah, it's a kind of patchy generalizations, but yeah, even and this is another thing I learned from the pub. I'd worked in the West End for a long time, in Mayfair in Covent Garden, and that I kind of lived there most of the time. I was managing a nightclub, and I was maitre d' in a restaurant and bartender at a couple of restaurants and stuff like this, and spent a lot of time there. And like so, one, pubs were part of the general thing after work, or you know, socializing. People from the pubs would. That's how I met the guys from the Eagle. That we and then some really decent restaurants back then. Typically, and there was a little Italian place and a French restaurant, really authentic, like auberge type places, closed suddenly, and after 30 or 40 years, and it was rent increases that did it, and then more anodyne, they were replaced with anodyne stuff. You know, in the run of my life, I thought this is a tragedy, it's typical, and all that kind of stuff, but it didn't really sink in. And then when I got into this pub situation, 5 years, no, it didn't. It wasn't 5 years in. The first the harbinger of this rent review process, which is essentially rentier capitalism. This was what it's all about. Rentier capitalism brackets disaster capitalism is what it's all about. Um, Maybe 6 months into the Sun and Doves, I'd got this, excuse me, runner-up award with the Evening Standard. Sorry, Time Out, and I'd been interviewed by a magazine called The Publican, which is a trade magazine back then. It doesn't exist anymore. And there was a double-page spread on the pub, and my area manager came in. He was called Graham. I can't remember. Graham Baldwin, I think he was called. Came in, and I swear he was rubbing his hands like that. And he said, "Well, I saw that article in the Publican there, 21,000 a week, eh? We'll be looking at six figures at your next rent review." And my rent was 32,000 quid at the time, and I was like, "What the fuck are you on about, mate?" And anyway, what I learned is that there's no fair rent review process basically at that level back then. Um,
So can I
and
just intercept at this
yeah,
point?
please do.
Because I know this, I mean, you haven't told me this story in this much detail. And I'm super grateful that you are, and you're making very, very clear to people how complex the system is. What is the incentive? Sorry if I'm asking a very, very naive question, but
This one.
what's stopping them just turning these buildings into resi now? If they're just making it so consistently impossible for people to survive, why would they just not repurpose these buildings now? The people
Well,
that don't care.
excuse me, that is quite a good question, because essentially that's what these pub companies do. They render pubs to alternative use. They run them down. You know, the impact of this business model, which is basically get as much rent out of each tenant as possible, and put it's all counterintuitive to normal people, to rational thinking people. It doesn't make any sense, because the inevitable consequence of increasing rent and increasing supply prices, bearing in mind that increased supply prices are being made alongside a parallel market which is not tied, where the pubs are owned by individuals or freehold, yeah, and there's no relationship to the cost of wholesale goods, and they can buy their stuff on the open market for like half the price that you can get it tied, right? So that it's not as if these executives who do this apply all these levers of extraction to the individual publicans can't anticipate what's going to happen. They just push turn the dial up on extracting money from this estate of pubs as much as they can. And I surmise, over a long period of watching all this happening, that at some point they've got a spreadsheet that's got 2,500 pubs on it, and pubs start dropping off the end of the spreadsheet if they turn the dial up too much, so they just turn the dial back a little bit.
Yeah.
Because there's rent reviews going on constantly all the way around.
But is there anyone stopping? Is there any laws in place? Because the other thing I want to say to you, Mark, is that you've had a shitty time of it.
Yeah.
And yet you're still talking about it. You've got a huge following. What's the hope? What hope are you harboring? What's the hope that you have? The other thing that I pushed back on you about when we talked offline was the idea that there were evil people who were going out of their way to make things shit. And then we agreed, I think, that it's just that, you know, selfish human beings or unaware human beings or frightened inner children will just continue to behave in a certain way, and the system will therefore change. But rather than us pointing fingers and just accepting that, you know, humans are humans, what hope do you have for how it could change? And what role would you like people to play in pushing that right back, not just a little bit back, but right back, and making it easier?
Well, okay, I'll try and just conclude that last bit that I didn't get to properly. I agree that I don't believe the people in the system, by and large, are trying to hurt other people. These are just consequences of the business doing its business. The people in the pub company, I think this is common in large organizations. They literally refer to the company as the business. They talk about the business needs this kind of stuff. So it's all kind of machined and impersonalized anyway. And they don't convert pubs directly to alternative use because they haven't got. It's not a very creative business model that they have. If they were really clever, they would screw everything out of the pubs and then retain the freeholds and sell them, and then do something, and then or refurbish them and let them out for something else. They would constantly getting revenue that way. But their business model is this box. Now, the problem with that process nationally to us as a nation is that we're told that this thing is happening. I'm getting on to think about there is hope that there's a way of turning all of this around. I'm absolutely convinced of this, and that's why I'm still doing it. But the problem with the story that the country has about the pub, our cherished national heritage icon, and so on, that's loved the world over, and all this, you can say these things about pubs and mean it, and it's authentic and it's genuine. There really is a deep affection, an attachment to pubs. And I think actually in my experience, many foreigners appreciate pubs more literally directly than we do, because they understand how valuable they are, because they've come to Britain on holiday and they've found a pub that they find pubs they can go to wherever they go, and there they can meet local people and they can learn about stuff, and it's very social, right? We take them for granted because they've been part of this for so long. Now we have been told for 30 years, we've been gaslighted really by large corporate bodies, that the reason pubs are failing is because our habits have changed because of things like social media, smoking ban. It used to be seatbelts. There's a myriad of reasons why pubs are failing, and why we don't go to pubs anymore. Yeah, I think I might have said home entertainment, cheap supermarket booze, and using social media instead of sitting around a table and chewing the fat, right? Now, all these things kind of ring true to busy people who've got busy lives, who don't go to pubs very often. But if you get any of those busy people who've got busy lives who don't go to pubs very often and say to them, if your local pub was a fantastic pub, would you go to it? They all say, well, of course I would. But if you ask them that separate from that pivotal flip moment, they go, well, our habits have changed. But our habits have changed because the pubs have become run down and irrelevant because of this business model. Okay, so and the pub sector is quite big, in terms of numbers, although the number of pubs closing every year is increasing all the time, and it is a private equity bun fight selling them off and converting them to alternative use. But the solution to this is simply that if we could do what I did to my pub, and this does happen quite often, like the Eagle, there are numerous examples around the country where run-down, knackered, totally unfit for purpose pubs have been bought by people who kind of understand what needs to be done, and they always do well
Do you happen to know the
bought.
Grafton in Kentish Town? Do you know the
The
Grafton?
Grafton, no, I don't know.
I'm just wondering, so I used to live in Kentish Town, if the Grafton is very independent, or if it's in one of these tied lease situations. And I guess
Yeah.
because the pubs I love are the
Hmm.
pubs that I think we're talking about, are the pubs that are not part of a chain or don't seem to be part of a
Yeah.
chain because they
Yeah.
have their own signature, their own brand, and a really strong presence in their community. And they're doing
Yeah.
wonderful things and they're hosting great things and there's great music nights and, you know, they're doing some fun outreach work and, you know,
Mm,
they're more than just a pub.
absolutely.
And what I'm hearing from what you're saying and what I think is what's in my gut about this, which, you know, I wasn't sure about because I am not an expert in the pub industry, although I'm making it my business to listen to the likes of
Mm,
you,
yeah.
is that the only way forward really is to change the story for people who do not understand, cannot see, even though it's right in their face, what the
Yeah.
value of a pub is for community, for
Yeah.
society. Um, and it's the responsibility of those that are independent, almost without putting too much on their shoulders, to kind of rebrand the whole system
Totally
so
agree.
that those who've been gaslit, as you say, gaslighted, whatever the phrase is,
Yeah.
um, are actually, you know, the whole narrative has changed around, and people are getting behind and would be therefore horrified to understand that the
Yeah.
rents are going up and up for people trying to do their best in
Mm,
community by way of a pub, right?
I totally agree with you. And the difficulty, pardon me, the difficulty at that level is, I don't know if penetration is the right word, but it is. It's about penetration because, like, as a result of my rent reviews, I learned that I learned all this really, just touching on what you were saying, that people need to know what's going on here because other people are signing leases and they're being rolled over. And you know, I lasted for 16 years. Some people last longer than I did, but most people fail within 2 years of signing a tied lease. Yeah, the statistics are scandalous, but the statistics for business failure in the tied pub sector are publicly available.
Mm-hmm.
All of the all of anything I say, and I try to be always factual, but a lot of it's from memory. Um, and you can say some pretty outrageous stuff. It all sounds kind of a bit hyperbolic, but it's all on public record and through select committee evidence and parliamentary evidence and all kinds of stuff through whole market surveys of the pub sector that have been done over the last 25 years. The problem is this summary, which is basically these pubs are owned by extractive corporate bodies that are not there to steward the future of pubs. They're there to extract money. I mean, yeah, these pub companies are pretty much all funded by hedge funds, which just kind of says it all. Okay. And it's not to demonize, this is just a fact. It's just the way it works. They're a microcosm of the way rentier capitalism is affecting everything in society. It's happening here. It's more obvious because it's in pubs, but the story doesn't get out. The story doesn't get out because they've got the voice and they control the narrative. The big businesses control the narrative,
But
and
do
you got
they?
that.
I'm going to push you on
Yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So they've you've got a 4,700 person following.
Mm,
Someone who owns a pub is going to have a lot of sway in their area because they
yeah,
care. What
yeah.
makes you think that the horrible hedge funders have the control of the narrative about this industry?
Just life experience because I know from my own experiences. Okay, so when I started telling customers over the bar, there's a bunch of things I learned. It's all about learning. First of all, some customers say we don't want to know about your problems. Right? Right. I'm not trying to tell you my problems. It's not a woe is me. I'm just telling you, do you know how this thing works? Do you know how these things work? So you tell me your house has been doubled in value because of me, and I'm living in a flat upstairs that I rent. And I just want to draw your attention to the fact that the pub is not part of that. The pub's regeneration, it's a kind of it sparked this whole kind of gentrification, if you like, of this area, but at the same time, it is not part of that intrinsically itself because
Mm.
the tenant is at risk of losing the rent review, in which case the pub will close. And then, so, um, and I know from talking to, I mean, dozens and dozens of other tide licensees who've done pretty much the same as me. They've told loyal, regular customers what's going on. Um, and they are these people, they are scandalized by this because they all feel very attached to the pub, to the licensee, to the people who are running it, and it's very deep emotional stuff.
Mm.
But the story doesn't go much beyond that. And so, and I know this because I co-founded a campaign called the Fair Pint campaign which launched in Parliament in 2008, and it led eventually to through a series of iterations of the where Fair Pipe became a steering member of a larger group rather than the campaign. It led to the introduction of the Pubs Code in 2016, which regulates the behaviour of the pub companies towards their tenants. But by then, I'd been homeless for 3 years already and evicted and bankrupted, and I had a really horrific experience, as do thousands of other tenants. And
But think about how far you've, I mean, because you talk, you're so generous in sharing your story, but, and then you throw in the detail about having got it that far into Parliament and it, having moved the dial significantly.
That's what you see, that is what's so interesting. And so I had a unique perspective on this. I mean, a really unique perspective on this, because most publicans that were involved in bringing this legislation into place were working huge hours. I was still working, but I had a business partner who we negotiate. We didn't negotiate anything. We just agreed that this campaign was really important, and for it to succeed, it needed quite a lot of time being put into it. So I was the one who drew an income from the flat above and didn't draw any money from the pub. And she ran the business, and I kind of dipped in and out of the business continuously and did other stuff, which was all supporting the pub's long-term prospects. Because conceivably, if the legislation had come in earlier, it would have I wouldn't have ended up losing a rent review and getting evicted. There was a whole bunch of other things going on. And I got involved with some civil society organizations, which I had time to do because of this. I got involved in I became the chair of the local arts festival. It did not take up a lot of time. It sounds shocking. It didn't take a lot of time, but it was very good for the business, very good for me, kept me sane. And out of that experience, I became co-founder of a thing called SE5 Forum for Camberwell, which is still going. It's a community forum. It's a cross-borough community group, which talked about the problems of non-porous boundaries between different local authorities. I learned huge amounts about civil society in general and all kinds of stuff, but it all emanated from my being a publican. That's what I found fascinating about this whole thing.
But think about how long it's taken me and how much poking to get this out of you in this conversation. And I knew some of this before, so I'm being a bit mean.
Yeah.
But it takes a lot for people to kind of, it takes a lot to tease out some pretty amazing stuff about you.
Yeah.
Mark, that you've achieved.
Mm.
Stuff that you've achieved.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I just want to come back to the hope thing. What do you want? What would you like to see?
Well, so the hope thing is, I see, I hesitate because I've had a long experience of being told that essentially I've got no idea what I'm talking about, but I do understand a huge amount more about this than anybody else because I spent so long devoted to doing it. I've talked to academics from literally all over the country and the world who've studied pubs and their social value, about their findings and stuff, and historians of the pub and everything like this, try to find out what the special thing that Hilaire Belloc wrote about is in the pub. I've sat in a room with 20 people or so around a round table, and this is more than once, who are all some of the major voices in Britain deciding what's going to happen to the pub sector. We've been describing legislation and stuff like this. And then somebody said, well, what is a pub? And everybody goes, well, it's really difficult to describe what a pub is. So I've been very interested in that thing because I know if you can tap it. So the solution is telling the story cogently in a very clear marketing way, which is not my forte, to the nation in the form of an advertising campaign, a marketing campaign, and tapping into that outrage and making it completely honest, open, and transparent. The whole thing, so you can make astounding statements about the pub and the value it brings to Britain. And then if anybody goes and checks out these statements, they can find they're true, right? And I mean, you could also come up with some outstanding statements about how these big corporates treat pubs that are scandalous and shocking. You don't really need to do that. You just need to understand that wherever there is a closed pub, which is a result of this extractive business model, and they are all over the country, literally, there is a community around that pub that wants that to be a great pub. Now, our story conventionally says, well, the pub's failed and it says there's a really common one which comes out again and again and again, which is, if you didn't want to lose it, you should have used it. And and it sounds, in a way, it sounds like it's got some value, but it we didn't use it because it was a shithole, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not our job to prevent a pub from closing. I mean, I myself as a customer, I don't want to go to horrible places. No one wants to go to horrible places. If it's run down, the toilets stink, the floors are sticky, the people behind the bar look like they're going to commit suicide because they're so depressed. I'm not even, I'm not
Yeah.
really even exaggerating it. It's like, and the products are rubbish, and it's because the pub is failing because it's underinvested, and it's been extracted from. Now we don't see that; we just see a rubbish rundown pub. But to expect this is how the gaslighting works, because the story is that we should be, if people can get themselves out of that
Yeah.
understanding, and that's why it needs the penetration. That's why it's why this market.
I'm gonna invite you to use some slightly different words. So we both love the book Citizens, and in that book, John encourages us to clean the dog shit off our own doorstep and not wait for anyone else to do it.
Yeah,
And in that vein, I think what's happening possibly, because there's something of a sort of intentionality or agency around the word gaslighting, which suggests a sort of sinister, on purpose, you know,
yeah, yeah.
element
That's
to
fair
this.
enough. Yeah,
And I think what is just to be accepted is that there's a few people, a few bits and bobs in the picture that all need to pitch in. So it's definitely the publicans, of course, but then it is also the local people who, if they were to understand better how their part to play is hugely valuable, because I think the problem is people don't quite realize what the invitation is. It's not clear what the invitation is. It's not clear how to use a pub. It's not clear. There's a boundary. There's not enough conversation being taken place.
yeah.
There's not enough conversation taking place between those people who are so depressed and those people who are crying out for somewhere, a space, for whatever reason. And that's the problem. There's a problem around communication.
No, I agree with you, but it's kind of intractable. I don't mean that I don't mean that to sound fatalistic, but it is because um, I've been close to being in that situation myself, and I knew for pretty much 10 years that I would probably end up being bankrupted. At that there was always a chance I might win rent reviews, but now when when it comes to that point that you just described, the people running the pub are in a no hope situation because they need the pub needs investment and they can't raise that investment.
Can I ask you
The
about
pub,
that? How many pubs are there? Just, for those of
well,
us who don't know the
yeah,
stats, how many pubs that are on the market now are within that tied lease, tied ownership system, and how many are there for the taking for independent people who,
yeah.
could avoid this entire situation that you're describing?
Sorry, can I just clarify? Are you asking about pubs which are actually already on the market, freehold available, or
That are
in the
not,
market in general?
I'm asking what the percentage of pubs
Okay,
that are available are already tied up in this horrible matrix, and how many of them are actually low hanging fruit for people who are
yeah.
hungry to create these community hubs
Well,
that we're talking about,
the,
that would
the,
not then be dragged down by at the mercy of a rent review.
yeah. Okay. So I mean, figures are actually quite difficult to nail down because no whole market surveys are done on a regular basis. Um,
But are we talking 50-50? Are we talking 595?
well,
What's,
say that there's something around 40,000 pubs in total. 20,000 of those are tied pubs, the ones I'm describing, and there's maybe, I don't know, maybe 5 or 8,000 which are genuinely what we think of as independent pubs, which are
and they're
owned by the
still
people who run them.
independent now. And are you concerned that before too long they will be swallowed by the monster as well? Is that
Oh,
the concern?
I don't think the pubcos are. I don't think many of the pub companies at that level are buying um, viable trading pubs that are run in what we would consider the idyllic way, where there's a freeholders owned by the people who work them, because if they're it's not part of the pub company's business model at the moment, because they're trying to conserve cash, and they're in terrible financial problems themselves.
So how many
Um,
pubs did you say at the least there were that were still running this utopian way?
again, it's very difficult. My stab in the dark on that one is around about 7 or 8,000, but I might be
Around
wrong.
the whole country?
Yeah, which is not many. But interspersed with those, there are pubs like where there's a whole bunch of there's roughly 20,000 pubs that are owned by large corporate bodies that run them as Weatherspoons is one end of that spectrum, and that's quite big. It's about 800 pubs, and we kind of know who they are. But at the other end, there are pub companies. There's an outfit called the Restaurant Group. There's an outfit called Mitchells and Butlers. They've got brands of chains of pubs which are I think they're called non-branded brands, right? They've kind of copied what this kind of ideal thing.
Yeah,
So they've got
I've seen, and
quirky
it's
furniture.
difficult to differentiate. I've done quite a
Yeah,
lot of
yeah,
market research in this space
yeah. That's
now, and when
right.
you come across a really gorgeous looking brand of a pub,
Yeah, yeah,
you're
yeah.
not quite sure. Are you part
No, that's
of? And
right.
it takes a bit of needling to work out if they're.
It is very interesting. I can't remember who it was now. I met a guy. This happened a few times. I met a guy in North London to talk about the whole thing, and he said, "We'll go to my local." And I walked in and said, is this a Mitchells and Butlers?" And he was like, what? And he was like, "This, what you doing?" So well, it just strikes me as being, and it was, and I can, when this is your business, you pick up, this is an
Yeah,
enterprise, but this
but
feels like
are
fun.
you saying that those guys are actually for the pub narrative that we're talking to here
No,
because
no, they're not.
they're.
They're managed pub chain, so they own the freehold. They employ the staff.
But would they be for the survival of the pub narrative as a thing for society, as opposed to not giving a
I
shit and being part of that
I think
private
I
equity,
think
don't
yeah,
care?
again, I think that's an interesting question, because until I started learning about business like this at this level, corporatized version of stuff, financialized, all this kind of stuff, I assumed that every business, no matter where it was coming from, no matter how big, ultimately had people in it who were there for a sense of purpose, which was constructive, not destructive. And when it comes to really big business, I think a lot of the time the business is just a thing. It just operates within its own. It's like got a life of its own, and everybody from the chief executive down, they're just part of this machine. And then and one version of this kind of big corporate entity tends to be less extractive than another. And in the pub sector, the really extractive bit is the tide sector, and the other bit is the managed. And it's not in their interest to run their pubs down, right? It's not in that sector's interest to allow budlies to grow out of the drains at the top, yeah, and for plaster to fall off the walls in the toilets and stuff like that, because it's very costly to repair that kind of damage. Whereas if maintenance is done on a regular basis, that doesn't happen. In the free type hub sector, all of that maintenance and upkeep of the building is devolved to the individual tenants to do, because they've got fully repairing and insuring leases, which means they have all the responsibilities of a freeholder. And if that work doesn't get done because they're not making any profit, the next tenant that comes along, once the existing tenant has failed, and the next tenant that comes along, they take on a more dilapidated pub than it should be. And it goes on for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So the pubs don't get, very often you go into a pub. I was in a pub just before Christmas where with the boiler, the gas boiler was installed before the boiler had been installed at the Sun and Doves, that when I signed the lease in 1995, right? And the boiler in the Sun and Doves was obsolete then, right? And the reason I went to this pub is because he had no heating. And I mean, it's just tragic. Tide pub, he was Stonegate, like I was Stonegate. Um, and yeah, so the other side of the private, uh, most of the pubs in Britain are owned by large corporate bodies, but they're run as a business to make money in some form of some vision of sustainable return on investment. Whereas this side, there's no idea of sustainable return on investment at all. It's just when the pubs have all been sold or they've all been run into the ground, these entities will just evaporate, they'll just go away. They've got huge debt, most of them. There are activities in the pub sector which suggest that maybe there's Heineken and Green King. They're private equity. They're not hedge fund backed, but they're still private entities. But nevertheless, they behave rather like the others do. And there's a small number of the authentic, truly original, genuine pub. And within the pub sector, there's roughly 180, I think it is now, formerly tied pubs that have been bought by the local communities through being listed as an asset of community value. And there's quite a lot of optimism around that thing happening, but that mechanism manages to save, I contend, at the most 20 pubs a year. And there's roughly 1,000 pubs a year failing. So it's kind of statistically invisible, although locally very valuable wherever a pub's saved like that.
But there's examples of it.
Oh yeah.
And may I just ask you to tell us, maybe you'd like to, is that what you're saying when you say that you're hopeful that what would you like for listeners to this conversation and me to walk away with in terms of what we should try to, what is the hope piece here? I'm hopeful. I'm naturally optimistic, as you're probably now getting to know.
I'm optimistic naturally too. Yeah.
But I'm optimistic, but not. I'd like to think not an idiot. Meaning, I am optimistic and understanding about important work to be done, as opposed to waiting for someone else to do it. But I need to know what it is that is expected of me. And I dare say, there's quite a few people who have a lot of kind of, in some way or another, influence, either that they have the energy, or they might know somebody, or they are, able to negotiate investment. One of my questions to you is, how do you go about buying from the private equity people a pub that's already within their system? Are they willing to sell them?
No, that's right. Well, okay. So the market as it has been, the hope there is existing lies in the market as it is, because the market is failing. The tied pub sector is failing. It has been failing for a long time, and the consequence of that is there's a large number of rundown pubs around the country, dotted everywhere geographically, that are formerly tied pubs that no one is interested in buying, because they're very expensive to repair and bring back into use as pubs, because the boilers are 50 years old, and they need new wiring, they need everything. The whole thing, the building services lifespan has come to its end, and it needs to be reinvigorated entirely. So that's a lot of money to invest. And then they all basically, so a lot of money is needed to, sorry, I'm rambling. They are essentially distressed assets.
Yeah.
They're essentially distressed assets because they're so run down anyway. They're trapped in a kind of weird limbo, because they can't be sold. They can be sold to people who would like them to be a house or residential, but the planning law around conversion of pubs to residential is quite tight. So it's difficult to get that to happen.
But if somebody wanted to buy them and turn them into a pub, back into a pub.
Yeah, there's nothing preventing that from happening at all. And so my proposition is, you raise a lot of patient capital, buy these pubs.
And would you, having seen this happen in a number of different ways, what's a successful business model? Is it a community coming together and a number of people owning it, and then being responsible for sitting on a board, as it were, and managing it as they would a social enterprise? Is that what you're proposing?
No, I'm not. That's pretty much the way the existing community pub movement works. And so you find there are a lot of communities around the country who bought their pubs, and I can't think of one. I've met all of them by any means, but I've met at least 30 of them over the years, and I've not met one who's not concerned about committee burnout once they've saved their pub. Now, my contention is very straightforward: is expecting communities to buy their pubs and save them is a nice administrative idea on paper when you're in government and you're looking at how can you get the Localism Act to work. But the reality is most communities just want to have a great pub. And I accept entirely that a great pub involves community. It's an important part of it. But the model that's been kind of that's evolved, which is in use at the moment, is rather inefficient. And I don't want to criticize it
No,
at
that's
all.
fine. It's fine. I want to air this sort of reality
It's
because that's the
it
point of
it,
this
it
prodding
yeah.
exercise. Can I just also ask you to touch on, because I'm mindful of time, that you have tried, haven't you, to apply for funding from
Yeah,
trusts
yeah.
and foundations?
Okay, so
Just touch on that.
so to take the evidence from the existing market, all the evidence together to show that a managed pub company, inverted commas, a bit like JD Wetherspoon, like that's how it functions as a managed. The staff are trained, they're paid centrally, and so on. So that would be the machinery of the pub company buying pubs, retrofitting them to be suitable for suitable for pubs. Um, you take away all of the hard work that communities have to do, all the commercial stuff, all the admin, all the stuff that makes a pub really difficult to actually get yourself into running. And then then this commercial entity, which is a pub company, which is set up to work on behalf of the community of the nation, right? Not just individual communities, the nation, would have would kind of project manage the entire process, identify the pubs that are on the market, reach out to local communities saying, would you be interested in being involved in the reinvigoration of your pub? Then setting up helping the triage. There needs to be triage at every level. The local community needs to be triaged to see if they can actually run and set up a stakeholder group. If they haven't got the experience of doing that, that can be facilitated quite easily. So all these things that we know happen in social engagement and community engagement, all that stuff can be applied. And then once the community starts to feel confident in their relationship with this entity that's turning their pub into their pub, then you get a free exchange of information. And it's all about people developing good quality relationships, actually. And John Alexander talks about this kind of stuff widely in his book, and it was really inspiring for me to read that. And that's why I was interested in what you were saying. And incidentally, I've got a book called Connected Communities by Cormac Russell, um, which is which describes this process, but without pubs in the middle, of how do you make engaged communities, connected
Yeah.
communities.
And this is what I'm excited about, because when I say I fantasize about pubs, it's not because I do love margarita, and I have
Yeah,
worked in a pub, and
all
so
right.
I do, and I'm extremely nostalgic, quintessential loving of Britain, and there's a whole story for
Yeah.
me there as to why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I see that, I see them as the link.
Mm.
And I'm excited, I have to say. I know that sounds really sort of like bleh, but
It
when
doesn't.
I
It sounds.
see that there's potentially a nice story, and I imagine that it's taken up, we've been talking for an hour, and this is just the beginning of your and my friendship, because I'm absolutely thrilled
Yeah.
that we've met, and I think there's a lot more to be
Likewise.
discussed. But I think when you said it, just I think half jokingly suggested it might just be a marketing sort of storytelling
It is.
thing.
Yeah.
I feel like it is. I feel like there's something here.
It, the story needs to be told in a very slick, accessible way, and it needs right. So to get from this conversation to the point where this thing is happening, where we've got this People's Pub Partnership, and it is a constituted pub company. It is constituted now. It exists. It's a company's house. It's been inactive pretty much since 2011, and last year we it came out of dormancy and did some work with Lincoln University around establishing a legal governance model for this thing to exist around. And as it is, it's got some articles of association which are not for profit, but they were drafted in something like 2013, and they're not appropriate for contemporary use anyway. It's not a multi-stakeholder entity, because basically the legal foundation of this pub company needs to be written in very clear English in language that anybody can understand, and it has to align the interests of all users of the pub. That includes the suppliers, the staff, volunteers, investors, customers. And I talk to people in the corporate movement, they go, "Oh God, that's so complicated." No, it's an agreement that people come together around, and and it says that everybody will be treated equally, and the planet will be one of these stakeholders, by the way. Sorry, and they will share in the investment and share in the reward. and the reward will be capped at something like 4%. I say this, but it needs to be done by a group of people who agree on it, basically, and the constitution's finalized. I've got a draft constitution
This
between
is,
either
I
of
mean,
them.
what I would just, I'm just gonna have a look where we're at.
Yeah,
If we were coming up with this utopian idea of ours, and there was
yeah.
no space yet to host the thing, it would feel overwhelming. Yeah, because what we're talking about is not impossible, but it's big, right? But
Well,
the big
I,
but is
I,
there's already these spaces. These spaces are beautiful aesthetically. They've got
mhm,
so much history. People already love pubs without you even being able to articulate what a pub
yeah,
is, or like an entire parliament of people not being able to articulate
it's
what a
right.
pub
Yeah,
is, but we all
yeah,
agree that they're important.
yeah,
So those are two really important things within how successful this thing might be, i.e. the
mm.
physical space and the kind of ephemeral
Oh,
love part of it, which everyone buys into. So you've got, oh yeah, it does that thing,
no, no.
doesn't it?
When
It's
you
really
did
weird.
that, a
I
thumb
know, I
started
can't
floating
switch it
up.
off. For anyone that's listening, I on Zoom have this funny setting which, despite always turning off, just keeps turning itself back on, which is every time I gesticulate it does a thumbs up.
I thought it was magic.
It is magic. I thought you were going, yes, she understands. Yes, she's
Well, I
got
am.
it. She's got it.
I am. Yeah.
But I think let us conclude this part of the conversation, Mark,
Yeah.
as we're more than halfway there. If you've got the physical space and the ephemeral love, yes, there's quite a lot of administrative bits and bobs and whatnot, but
Well,
there's quite a lot of wealthy famous people. I keep thinking of chefs who've bought pubs and gone, oh, I'm going to make a nice passion project out of this,
I
who
know a few stories.
presumably agree that this is important and
I
have a
know a few
voice.
stories. Yeah. Yeah. I know a few
There's
stories of very famous people who've taken on tied leases, and it's been all fanfare. And the pub company said we love working with someone like Gordon Ramsay because
yeah,
blah 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 blah. And then
yeah.
when the pub fails, they quietly doesn't get announced, down the line.
Ah,
Yeah,
interesting.
it's quite common.
Right.
And
So is there potentially a bit of honesty from those people that they had the wool pulled over their eyes a little bit,
I
that you
think
think they might be shying away from? Is
I,
that
I
what
think
might
it's
be happening?
yeah. I mean, I think it's difficult. I don't know. I mean, I've spoken to a couple of representatives of these well-known people who, um, they're a bit circumspect. They basically say they're okay. They're not interested in getting involved in anything. Um, and this is how.
Can you think of any successful, independent, well-known spokespeople that might fly the flag, bearing in
Um,
mind everybody?
there are. Well, you see that again. That's an interesting question because, and this is why pubs fall between the cracks everywhere, because there are well-known people, but they're all hard to get hold of. And like Tom Kerridge, for example, I think I really admire him. He's got a relationship with Green King, I think it is. It might be Punch. I can't actually remember now. Um, but he's very strongly food-led, and he's got a relationship there. But it's not his job to go campaigning about it or to be criticizing it either. And his he does really good work anyway in a very big way and very large, expansive stuff. And he did do a brief. He started a series called Saving Britain's Pubs in 2021, 20. I can't remember what it was. It was during it was as lockdown was arriving, and he did a really good job of it. But then lockdown came, coronavirus came, and it kind of curtailed the entire project. Um, and conceivably, I think the issue is right. The market, right, the legal and governance has got to be established, which is basically a trading entity that aligns the interests of all people who are involved in the business. And the key thing at the end of it is it treats everyone equally, and no one can walk away with more power or money or influence than anybody else in the setup. And it's got and it means the trading organization runs as a managed pub company. There's probably needs a board of trustees to ensure that all the
Before we get into
objectives
the
are,
weeds,
are
I'm going
got
to
to.
stop. We're going to stop here.
Yeah.
And I love it. I love the weeds. No problem. We can go there. But for now, I'm just going to ask you to, if you don't mind, do you mind name dropping a couple of the trusts and foundations that you either have had a conversation with, that you're hopeful would appreciate what you're trying to do?
Joseph Roundtree, Co-ops UK, I'm in conversation with now. This is great, isn't it? The names are all evaporating.
Esme?
Power to Change, Esme Fairbairn.
Tudor?
Pardon?
Tudor Trust?
Tudor, I don't know them actually. Nesta,
Yeah.
it's great. I can't. Oh yeah, I mean Young Foundation. I've engaged with Young Foundation. They said all we need is money. It's so far worked out. Just needs money. Forum for the Future. Well, what's John Alexander? His organization is
Citizens UK, is it?
yeah.
Sorry, I get a bit confused because there's two of them.
The New Citizenship Project,
New
isn't it?
Citizenship Project.
Yeah, they're interested.
But that's not a funding body, is it?
No,
That's
no,
a
no. When you
consultancy.
say funding, no, sorry.
Yeah. No, I'm curious to know who you've already spoken to, and we are going to wrap up here because this is a podcast.
Yeah,
There's far more information in here, and the thing that I find both incredibly energizing and also, what's the word? I don't know. It's not draining. It's a feeling of having to be patient when I speak to you, is the awareness of how much information you have that you've amassed through personal experience and through the academic and practical research that you've had to do in this space. I think it's a weightiness. It's a sense of weightiness.
yeah.
That you hold this, and that I think the work I would like to do in conversation with you as a friend is to kind of tease out the bits that that are really good headlines that people can grasp onto and run with. And that's why I think we'll save the weeds for another day, because I want to know what the headlines are today, which I think we very much have covered off in this amazing
Yeah,
conversation.
yeah.
But I also have some names, and we also have some people that we can say, listen to this. Let's carry
Oh,
on this conversation. Let's have this conversation more and more.
yeah,
And you and I talked before today about how, yes, it has been very frustrating, but
yeah.
it might be that now is the time. Now might be the time. People are starting to think about a number of things that you've touched on today, and therefore it might all be ripe for the taking in a way that it hasn't for the last
Yeah.
20 years. And that's the exciting bit.
No, I think you're right. And incidentally, the RSA is another one. It's a modest amount of funding.
Cool.
A problem in these conversations is that I'm seen as a lone agent of this idea, and but
Do people know
I'm
that
not.
you don't want to be alone?
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot. I've got a huge number of people who are really sympathetic to this
Yeah,
happening, but
that you
it's
do.
kind of, we're all consumers. They kind of want it to be delivered on a plate. But I don't mean that
Mm,
pejoratively. But there's
I'm
a
not
lot of
sure
that.
you're right. I think you've got
Well,
more friends that would be up for sharing the load with you than you might like to think.
what I don't mean I don't mean to sound like poor me at all. A big issue is this legal and governance thing, and I've been in meetings. There've been two groups of people you could call a steering group with me, who have kind of given up on, have been worn out by the process of trying to get this legal and governance things nailed down. But that is actually live and happening now. So
Are we talking
and
about perhaps then it needing to gather moss by
yeah,
way of you seeing it start slowly and actually
yeah,
joining the dots of what I'd like to see you as, or what I do see you as already, is like a sort of you know whatever the male version of a fairy godmother is, mentor for anybody that would
yeah,
like to buy, if they stumble on a pub that is either a Tide thing lease pub that is for sale and to be taken out of that system, or
yeah,
one that's independent, or
yeah,
somebody that already owns an independent pub that might be struggling slightly, that with just 1 or 2 hours with you, they will be so much more in the know of what they need to be
yeah.
careful of, what they could do. And it's an energizing sort of opportunity to spend an
Mhm.
hour or two with you. and then for the dots to be joined enough that, you know, a handful of these projects that show what good looks like would help very much move the dial in terms of setting this other bigger
Yeah,
structure up that you have
yeah,
in mind. But I hear what you're saying.
yeah.
Like locally, people don't really care necessarily and feel a bit overwhelmed by that level of detail. What they want to
Mm,
do is know what their small part to play is.
yeah, you're right. And the purpose of the pub company would be to provide, basically, to be the vehicle that people can um, do all the exciting stuff around and on the back of, because the dull stuff is really hard to do, and but it's not difficult. It's only hard to do when you don't have the experience of doing it. When you do have the experience, this is how the other pub companies, not the pub companies we're talking about, they depend on tenants to do all the work for them. But the other pub companies, all this stuff's just it's just like that. It's just done as a matter of course. You take in a pub, refurbish it, make it nice, fill it with staff, put products on the bar, and it gets busy. You know, it's just a machine. It sounds flippant to say this, but it is. The people like going out to nice places, and if you make a place nice for them to go to, and it's got products which suit their taste, that includes non-alcoholic stuff as well. Um, and you know, and pubs deserve a lot of thought being put into them. The large pub companies don't do that. But the principle is that the way of saving pubs currently from this inevitable slide into nothingness, which is going on all around us, is is putting a lot of expectation on people who I think completely unfairly on people who live around a pub, who want a great pub, and then they've got to take on all. You know, I've talked to hundreds. I'm not exaggerating. I've talked to hundreds of people in communities, and it's a really stressful process saving their pub, unless they're a very confident community, like the people in Drew Stainton. You know who you are. Um, um, it's a very difficult process for people to take on saving their local pub. And this is about freeing that up, playing to people's strengths, de-risking the entire process, providing capital in the right places, and sorting out the niggly bits, which are kind of just their administrative issues,
Yeah.
really.
And we, you
And
know, East Marsh United, and I interviewed Josie Mean recently, and she was featured in John's book as being an example, a rare but possible example of,
yeah,
you know, a beacon of light as to how this sort of stuff can happen in communities. And
yeah,
I just think, you know, what I'm in the business of doing, all I can be helpful with really is helping people to tell those stories of good, to tell
absolutely.
those stories of, like I say, what good looks like, what is possible. And
Yeah.
people just need to see that they are not alone, that there's a way forward, to be a
Well,
bit inspired. And actually that's all we can do to move the dial slightly. So that's my hope to, you know, as a what my role
yeah,
is in this. And I'm
yeah,
delighted to have befriended you. It
yeah.
really wasn't expected
Likewise.
that I would meet someone like you this fast in the process. And, you know,
Thank
when
you.
I find pubs or pubs find me because they are businesses, they would like to do more by way of, you know, sales and people retention and customer
Mm.
loyalty and do more in their community, I know who I'm going to call
Thank you.
immediately. And I'm
Yeah.
hoping that you're not going to be working for free as you have forever, just telling people all this stuff that you know. And I do think there's probably a
Yeah.
smarter way of you disseminating this information, or rather placing it all somewhere and then not burning out because you're just having to repeat yourself again and again.
Yeah, yeah. I know, absolutely. We could speak for 2 hours just about that side of it as well,
All
actually.
right,
And
well, that's
why,
the next podcast.
yeah. And
Anyway,
it's
I'm going to wrap
yeah.
this up for us today.
Thank you.
I'm so glad we did share this though, because like I
It's
say, it's not the easiest thing to talk about because there is some pain there, and you're so
been,
generous with your personal experience on this.
well, thank you. It's been a
But you
pleasure
know,
to meet
thank you.
you. I'm sorry, I was talking over you inadvertently. Sorry,
Not at all. I think I was
Francis.
just
But
waffling.
it's been really lovely meeting you as well. And it's an important thing, you know, the pub.
Does the Sun and Dove still exist or not?
It's called the Son of Camberwell now because I kind of I agonized over this for a long time, and I trademarked the name so that they couldn't use it unless
So
they
there's
bought it.
still a Sun and Dove's trademark
So
out there
so
somewhere.
it's yeah, yeah. So it's but the pub is called the Son of Camberwell now, and
Hmm.
yeah, it's nice to do very good food. I've been there a few times. I was interviewed by a German documentary film crew looking at because the Germans can't understand why we're not saving our pubs, basically.
Well, maybe there's a nice, wealthy German out there somewhere.
Yeah.
I'm going to go.
Thank you.
We're going to wrap this up. Lots of love, Mark.
Yeah, and
And
to
we
you.
will speak
Thank you.
soon.
Great.
Thanks,
All
everyone, for
right.
listening.